So everybody out live on the stream, we're running a little behind schedule in the classroom this morning, so we'll be with you in just a moment while I finish hooking up all the other gadgetry to do this. Oh, it would help if the projectors were on, wouldn't it? Okay, so we will. All right, we should be good on the iPad. Everybody can see that. And let me get on Twitch so I can watch the stream and make sure that I get questions. How's everyone doing this morning? I'm glad it's a Friday. Very much so. All right, well, let's get to it. So, let's just kind of recap a little bit about what we were doing last time. So last time we had my magic trick, as we were seeing, and the magic trick is, it's not really magic, right? It's just math. That I can turn addition into turn subtraction into addition by doing this sort of magic trick of flipping the digits, adding one, and then adding that instead of subtracting, okay? And this trick is in base 10, what we're doing is called 9 or 10's complement, depending on which number you're talking about. So when we took a number, so for example, like what we've got on the screen here, we had 127 minus 63 is just the problem we made up. And we said, okay, I'll take 063, right? Because I need to think of it still as being a 3-digit number. I flipped all of its digits, and that got me 936, and to which I added 1 to get 937. So the 936 we're going to call, in this case, the 9's complement of it. And then after you add 1 to it, and we got 937, that's called the 10's complement. You guys have probably never heard of this before, but that's all right. So the reason I mention that is because, and do all did the magic trick with base 10, is to convince you that this trick actually works, because this is exactly the trick that we're going to do with binary numbers, okay? But binary you're obviously less comfortable with because, well, you haven't been doing it your entire life. So, but this same trick will work in the binary world, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Okay, so just before I move on to that, let me just take, by way of example, we had the number, so 937 represented the number minus 63 in our 10's complement world, okay? So anytime we wanted to subtract 63, we could accomplish the same thing by adding 937 instead, and then discarding any final remainder. Okay, that was the other key here. Okay, so the other thing I want to convince you of that this works is, what would happen if I did 63 minus 63? What ought I get? I'd better get 0, okay? And because if I don't get 0, then something's really, really messed up. Well, how can I do 63 minus 63 with this magic trick? What would I really do? 63 plus the 937. Okay, and I should get 0. All right, well, so let's check that in fact we do. All right, so if I do 063 and 937 and I add them, then I get a 0 carry, 0 carry, 0 carry. And then for this particular example, what did we say? We started with 2 3-digit numbers, and therefore, if I get a carry beyond the third position, he's just gone. We discard it, okay? And so I do, in fact, get 0, okay? All right, so what's a little weird about this in base 10 is, well, I mean, other than it being kind of a trick that it even works, is the fact that I'm really going to think of 63 as 063, right? So I'm thinking of every number as having a specific number of digits that we set that number in advance, okay? For our purposes on the computer, this will, at least at first, always be 8 bits, or some other multiple, right? So we could do 16 or 32 or 64 bits, but we'll just, for the sake of doing this on paper, stick with 8 because that's sort of good enough. Okay, so let's flip over to a new sheet here and talk about how to do this in binary instead. All right, so let's take the number 63, which, just because we were using that, what's the bit pattern for 63? Well, here, actually, let me write it this way. I need to specify how many bits we're going to use to represent this number, and I choose that we'll do it with 8 bits, so hence I'm going to call this an int 8, right? Integer, 8 bits. How do we represent 63 in our system? Well, what's it going to be? Yeah. Okay, it's going to be more than that, right? We need to use 8 bits. So let's actually start from the far right. So if I had a 1, a 2, a 4, an 8, a 16, a 32, a 64, and a 128. Okay, for reasons that'll become clear in a moment, I'm going to put an X in the 128's position. We'll talk about why in a minute, but I still need to use that position, okay? Because I'm still doing everything in 8 bits. All right, so how would I write 63 in this? Well, 64 doesn't doesn't work, right? Because that's a 1 too big. And then what's kind of neat here is if you're 1 less than a power of 2, then what is everything after that? All ones. Okay, so that's kind of clever, right? So we'll have a 0 in those 2 positions, and then 1 1 1 1 1 1 1. Okay, so this would be 0B 0 0 1 1 1 1 1 1. So 6 ones. And in hexadecimal, what is that? 3F, good. Okay. All right, so there's 63 represented in binary using 8 bits. Great. So the question we want to answer is, how would I represent minus 63 using 8 bits in binary? Okay. Well, if we're to go off of our trick, our magic trick from base 10, what did we do in base 10 to get the sort of negative version? We did the flipping all the digits, right, where we did that sort of mirroring business, and then we added 1, right? Well, what's the digit mirroring going to look like in binary? 1 becomes 0, 0 becomes 1, right? There's only 2 digits to begin with, and so doing that mirroring thing is really just reversing them. Okay, so it's a lot easier to think about that in binary. Okay, so we have a bit pattern here, okay? And so the ones complement is just to flip all the bits. Okay, and let me be clear that we're all on the same page. When I say flip the bits, I mean a bit that's a 1 becomes a 0 and vice versa. I'm not like flipping the order or anything like that. I'm just swapping zeros with 1s and vice versa. Okay, good? Yes. Oh, yeah, if you're 1 less than a perfect square, okay, so 64 is a perfect square, 63 is 1 less than that, then you're going to have 1s in all positions afterwards. So 63 would have 1 in all positions to the right of the 64's place. That's just math, right? And it's because if you add up powers of 2, you get 1 less than the next power of 2. Yeah, that's just math. But if you forgot that fact, or if we didn't have 63, which was sort of coincidence that that was one of the numbers we were working with last time, then we would just say, oh, well, does 32 go into 63? Yes, 1 time. How much is left over? 15, or sorry, 17, or no, whatever. How many times does 32 go into 63? Bleh. Once, and how much is left over? 31, duh, of course, right? Because it's 1 less than the power of 2. And then the pattern repeats. So then we could just go through and do it like that if we didn't remember that trick, or if the number wasn't nice like 63. Okay, so 1's complement, this is kind of the role of 9's complement from when we did this with our normal arithmetic, where all I did was I mirrored the digits. Okay, so 0 became 9, 1 became 8, and so on. And then in binary, well, there's only 2 digits to work with, 0 and a 1. So 0 becomes 1, 1 becomes 0, and that's the end of it. Okay. All right, what was the other thing we needed to do? Add 1. Okay, so 2's complement is I'm just going to do the same thing, but I'm going to add a 1 to it. In this case, that's really easy to do because I had a bunch of zeros at the end. Okay, Gucci? All right, so now that I've got that, this number represents negative 63 in, or as a int 8. Okay, and we'll convince ourselves that that's correct in a moment. What's sort of our check to make sure that we've got this right? Well, what would happen if I added 63 and this number? I ought to end up with 0 when all said and done. Okay, and if I do, great. And if I don't, then something's gotten messed up somewhere. Okay. Questions so far? Yes.
So if we already had a 1 in the 1's place, would it just go up to 2 when we had 1 to 2's place?
Yeah, so like, let's say that you had this bit pattern down at the bottom and you added 1, then this would become a 0 and that would become a 1, right? So you would do the usual, when you do the adding 1 bit, you would do the usual carrying procedure that you would for any kind of arithmetic, yes. Okay. Yeah, good. We didn't have to here, but theoretically we could. And then we'll do another example in a minute where you have to do that. Okay, so great. All right, so I've got that bit pattern. And just on the subject, what is this in hex? Right, so this is 0B 11000001, or what is that in hex? Well, the far right part of it is 1, that's easy. What's in front of the 1? C, right, because it's 12. Okay, wonderful. So now that I've got that, and by the way, let's actually kind of see why that makes sense. So look at the numbers that we started with, 3F, and and then we ended up with C1. If we were to do this mirroring trick in hexadecimal, what would 0 pair with? Hexadecimal, right? 0 would pair with F, and 3 would pair with, well, 0 with F, 1 with E, 2 with D, 3 with C. So the 3 became a C, and the F became a 0, to which we added 1, and so we got C1 instead of C0. Oh, that makes sense, hopefully, right? So there's nothing special about doing this in binary. Yeah. Okay, so let's convince ourselves that this actually helps, because let's take the number that we had for 63. So 63 was 0, 0, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1. Negative 63 was 1, 1, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 1. And let's add those two dudes together. Okay, and if I do this correctly, then we should get 0, okay, if I haven't messed anything up until this point. Okay, so let's do the addition. Make sure we do, in fact, get 0. All right, so what's 1 plus 1? 0, carry a 1. Right, what's 1 plus 1? 0, carry a 1, and this pattern is going to repeat for a bit. Okay, so let me actually put that final carry in a different color. Okay, so what happens to a final carry beyond the 8th position? Toast. He's just gone. We totally ignore him. Okay. Now, why do we ignore him? Because we decreed from the beginning that 8 shall be the number of the bits, and the number of the bits shall be 8. Do you guys get the reference I was just trying to make there? Yeah, good. 3 shall be the number of the counting, and the number of the counting shall be 3. Thou shalt not count unto 4. 5 is right out. Now, from Monty Python and the Holy Grail, when the instructions for how to use the holy hand grenade of Antioch. Yes. After thou hast counted unto 3, pulleth out thy holy pin, and lobbeth thy holy hand grenade at thy enemies, that they may be blown to tiny bits in thy mercy. Now, how many of you guys have never seen this movie? Well, you got homework this weekend. It's not like you're going to any parties. So, yeah. Yeah, it's particularly hilarious. So, but it's dry, sarcastic British humor, so you kind of have to be in the mood for that sort of shtick. All right. Anyway, so we ended up with all zeros. This makes sense. We're good. Okay. Now, the reason that I put an X in that far left position is because let's think about, if I'm using 8 bits, how many different things can I encode with 8 bits? How many different 8-bit patterns are there? Or how do you compute this? Like, who cares what the answer is? But it's 2 to the 8th, right? Which happens to be, called, you remember? 256, right? Right. Okay, and that number we're going to be talking about, like, it's just going to be like branded on your forehead by the time we're done with this class. 2 to the 8th, right? Anyway, right, why is it 2 to the 8th? Well, because each bit position is independent, and you got 2 choices, so you multiply them, and we have 8-bit positions, because we're going to do everything in 8 bits. And so, yes, 2 to the 8th, wonderful. And how did we get 256? Well, 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 250, sorry, did I mess up? Did I miscount? 2, 4, 8, yeah, I started with 1 because I'm an idiot. 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 256, right? 8 bits. Okay, great. All right, so if I can encode 256 different things, and I want to encode numbers or whole numbers, if I'm only going to deal with positives, well, and zero, then what is the range of values that I can encode? Well, I want to encode zero. That's a good place to start. What would therefore be the biggest number I could encode if I don't care about negatives? 255, right? Because I spent one on the zero. All right, if I want to encode negatives and positives, then I kind of have to split the difference here, right? I can't encode negative 255 up through 255. That would be 511 things. That's too many, right? We would need 9 bits to do that. So if I say I'm going to only use 8 bits and I want to encode negatives also, then why don't we just sort of take the split the difference approach, and we'll say, all right, I'll let half of these be negative and the other half be the opposite, not negative, okay? So if I'm going to split things evenly, then what could I encode? I could encode either one of the following. I could either do negative 127 up to 128 or negative 128 up to 127. Okay, right? It sort of, which way am I going to split it, basically? And the way that we choose to split it is to go from minus 128 up to 127. There's a good reason for that. Okay, so that's why I put an X in the 128's position there, because can I encode 128 in 8 bits where I care about negatives and positives? No, I cannot. I can encode all the way up to 127 at the largest. Okay, and then the most negative I can encode would be minus 128. We'll talk about that number in a moment. Okay, okay. So this far left bit position essentially is going to act like a sign bit, meaning that if you look at what's in the far left position, that tells you whether or not the number is negative or not. Okay, where we include 0 as being not negative, right? Okay, so that's just the way that we split the difference. And the reason we split the difference that way is because if I wanted to write down 128, I would have to put a 1 here. And we want to think of having a 1 here as indicating that the number is negative, not positive. Okay, does that make sense? Yeah. So hence, the numbers we can encode with 8 bits, including the sign, is negative 128 up to 127. Okay, good. All right, so there's that. Let's talk about how you would encode a couple of other special numbers. Yeah, Cole, you got a question?
What kind of things are we, so when you are programming or making a negative number in
Mhm.
computer science, is it only for, like, what are you using, what does the negative value represent? It's like,
Ah,
like a might represent some big number. Why would you use a negative number?
well, two reasons, right? Probably the better reason is because we'd like to be able to do subtraction, right? And the reason that we're going to write down negative numbers in this way is because I can do subtraction by thinking of it as addition of a negative. Okay, so so there's one answer, right? Now, what a negative, excuse me, sorry guys, what a negative number would represent in like a computing context? Well, I mean, maybe a good example would be, let's say you were writing some sort of software to track um, like sales, right? You run a business, okay? Well, people buy stuff, so that's money coming in, positive. You buy supplies, that's money going out, and so you would want to put that in your account book as a negative. Well, you need a way to account for a negative. Now, on paper, how do we do this? You just put a minus sign in front of it, and like you know what that means. But since we're on a computer where there literally are only two things, 0 and 1, that's it. Where's the minus sign? Doesn't exist, right? And so hence we've got to come up with some other way to represent it, and this is the Well, it's not so much that you lose them; it's that you're allocating half of them for the negatives and the other half for the positives.
So it would take 16 bits to subtract 255,
Well, actually nine, but right, because you only need to go up one more bit position to double.
something like that.
Right. I mean, yeah, 16 bits, you certainly could do it, but if you wanted to, for example, do something minus 255, then you would need a ninth bit in order to do that. Okay. Um, Now, I should say that, of course, on modern computing hardware, um, pretty much like your smartphones, those are all 64-bit machines, which means that the integer arithmetic that they do is all 64-bit. Well, 64 bits allows you to encode a crap ton of different things. Okay. So the 8-bit here, we're going to do things in 8 bits just because it's easier to write down 8 bits than it is to write down 64 bits. The system is exactly the same, it's just more bits. Um, but what that means is that we'll sort of have an artificial looking limitation of only having numbers between minus 128 and 127. Okay, which does seem a little artificially limiting, I'll grant that, but it's sort of good enough to just get the sense for how this works on paper. And then when you do it on a computer, well, you just let, right, you sort of abstract away from the nitty gritty. Okay. Now, I should say, by the way, that there are some computers. So let's take, for example, and actually I'm going to switch over to my computer for just a moment, and we'll have Twitterception. Let me just go to this for sake of example. Yes, I know. And let's do a assembly one. Okay, so the let me take just as an example one of my favorite computer architectures. Oh, right. It's not switched over to the screen, so you guys can't see it, but everybody on Twitch can. Okay, let me fix that problem. Une minute, s'il vous plaît. That means this cable, actually, you know what? Let's do this less. Oh no, they zip tied that, of course. Okay, well, we'll just do it the Yank and Bank method. Ethan, do you know that method? Yank and Bank? It's when you know, turn your plane this way and then use the elevators to 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 do a turn rather than your ailerons and rudder. Yeah, yeah. Anyway, uh, okay. So my favorite computer architecture. Let me blow this up so it's a little bit easier to read. Is the old MOS 6502. And you guys eventually will wish that I would just shut up about this stupid architecture because um, yeah, now the reason that it's my favorite is because it is the very first computer architecture I ever used as a child. Uh, in particular, this processor in variants was used in the Commodore 64, the Atari 2600 and 5200, the Apple II, and most notably for our purposes as men, the 8-bit Nintendo. Okay, so the Famicom, which was the Japanese original, and then the Nintendo Entertainment System, which is what they called it for its US release, um, used this architecture. And it was an 8-bit architecture, asterisk. Okay, for arithmetic, everything was done in 8 bits, but it could sort of extend to 16 bits using some trickery. Okay. Um, for memory, it could allocate 16 bits worth of memory, which is why it was able to use a 64 kilobyte game cartridge. That's how much data you could fit onto a game cartridge. Um, But yeah, the arithmetic on this thing is in 8-bit asterisk. Okay, you really could do up to 16-bit, but it required a trick. Yeah.
So since like you're in Japanese,
Mhm.
how in coding, if you were to look at their code that they made it on, would it be in Japanese and like would there be a way to like switch that?
Yes. Okay. Fantastic question. So Cole's question was, well, since the Famicom was Japanese, how on earth did they program in this stuff? Well, no, I believe that they would program in English. Okay, and in fact, what they would program in is what you're looking at here on the screen, which is called assembly. And so let me actually back up a moment to say the Famicom was Japanese, right? It was made by Nintendo. The processor that was in it was, uh, well, it was called the Rico 2A03, but basically it was an MOS 6502. They had licensed the technology. MOS is an American company. In fact, they still kind of exist to this day, which is kind of freaky, right? They are still producing 8-bit processors that you can go and buy. And they're useful. Now you might ask, why on earth would you still be producing something that old? Well, a couple reasons. They're super low power now, right? Because I mean, the architecture's from the 70s, right? So it's not exactly advanced. Did anybody? This probably won't work very well at a men's college, but if this were a women's college and this were maybe 10 or 20 years ago, this example would work fantastically. How many of you guys ever played with a Tamagotchi? All right. Well, I guess you should transfer to a women. No, I'm kidding. Yeah, so you had a Tamagotchi? Yeah, okay. Or maybe those of you who have sisters, your sister had a Tamagotchi. Guess what processor was under the hood in the Tamagotchi? The 6502. Same thing that was in the Nintendo. Now, granted that the Tamagotchis came out in what, the 90s at some point, right? And so by that point, the processing, the manufacturing of the processor was super small, and therefore it took up exceedingly low power, which is what made it perfect for an embedded application like a Tamagotchi that ran off of like a little button cell battery or whatever, right? Um, yeah, so these things are still kind of useful. Plus, there's the nostalgia of, hey, let's learn how to program a Nintendo. Yeah, I think that's rad, but I'm also old school. Okay, so this architecture did all of its arithmetic in 8-ish bits. And I say ish because there was a way to sort of combine two 8-bit chunks into a 16-bit chunk, but you had to kind of take it in 8-bit chunks still. So it's a little weird, but yeah. Um, this meant, therefore, that there would be limitations in terms of games, right? Because unless you knew the tricks for how to sort of magically do 16 bits out of 8, then what would be your limit for a high score, for example? 255 or 127, depending on whether or not you were including negatives or not. Okay, yeah, Ethan.
So is that why like original Zelda you max out at 255 rupees?
Bingo. Because it's an 8-bit and it doesn't make sense to have negative rupees.
Right.
Um, well, actually, it does because if you spend the rupees on something, then but this processor did have a hardware subtraction uh, circuit, and so you didn't necessarily have to think of everything as being a positive or negative. You could cheat, okay? Which is yes, a perfect example of that. In the original Zelda, you max out your rupee count, your the coins or whatever gems at 255 because that's 2 to the eighth minus 1, right? Um, Another good example of this, although a little bit more modern, is um, what music video broke YouTube? This is a while ago, but you guys know? Yeah. Gangnam Style, right? So, right, that video, yeah, it broke YouTube. Why did it break YouTube? Well, they were encoding the play counts as 32-bit signed integers. Okay. How many things can we encode with 32 bits if we take into account sign? Well, how are we going to compute this? So this is actually not too hard to compute. You can, if you don't care about sign, how many things can you encode with 32 bits? You can encode 0 up to 2 to the 32 minus 1. Okay? If you, include negatives, you can encode negative 2 to the 16th up to 2 to the 16th minus 1. Okay? So what is 2 to the 16th minus 1? Oops, sorry. Wait a minute. I'm sorry. Not 16, 31, because coffee's not kicked in yet. That number. Okay. So if you use 32 bits, then, and you split half positive, half negative, then you can go from minus 2 to the 31st up to 2 to the 31st minus 1. Okay. Not half that. Okay. So what that means is that the maximum integer that you can encode with 32 bits, where you do include the positives and negatives in your world, is 2.1-ish billion. Okay, that's a pretty big number, way bigger than what your Nintendo can handle. I mean, imagine getting that would be cutting a whole lot of bushes to get that many rupees. Okay, but yes, it's 2.1 billion. That's a pretty big number. Well, so this was the format, 32-bit signed integer, that YouTube was using to store the play count for each video that was on YouTube. And that was all great and all until the Gangnam Style video came around, because then what happened? It exceeded that number. Okay, and what happens if you add 1 to this number? Well, in human math, what happens if you add 1 to that number? You get 2 point whatever, 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 and then the last digit becomes an 8, because we're not morons. But on a computer, what happens if you add 1 to this number? You get minus 2,147,483,648. Okay, so you go from having 2.1 billion positive to suddenly you have negative 2.1 billion. And that broke YouTube. Well, it's not as if like there was a small explosion in Southern California or something. No, it just broke. And of course, the reason they care about the play counters is because for the ad revenue, right? And so suddenly it was as if you owed YouTube like $1 million, right, from ad plays. So it broke that stuff, right? So they said, okay, fine. We're going to go back and we're going to encode everything. You know, I don't know how many of you guys read The Onion periodically? Yeah, hopefully. How many of you guys ever get tricked by an Onion article that you think it's real? Occasionally, right? But sometimes they're actually really on point. Okay, now this analogy will work fantastically in a men's college because, well, maybe you don't all actually do this, but we all have razors and occasionally have to shave, right? One of the occupational hazards of being a man. So, what kind of razors does everybody use? Okay, and no electrics. You're not allowed to answer electric. Okay, Gillette, how many blades are on it? 4? Okay. Anybody use the Mach 5s or whatever they, no? Anybody use Harry's? Yeah, that's what I use. Okay, they have 5 blades. Well, okay, so back in the day, there was sort of an arms race on the number of blades on a razor. So, in the 70s or 80s, the big revolution was to put 2 blades on a razor instead of just 1. Okay. And for years and years and years, that's what people used, was a double-bladed razor. That's actually what I started shaving with when I was like 15 or whatever. Okay, great. So then I turned 18, and I got a little package in the mail that I wasn't expecting, and it was from the Gillette company, and it was a free Mach 3 razor with some blades, and it said "Happy 18th." I was like, "Sweet." Yeah, right. Now here's the other thing. How do they know that you're turning 18 other than like them harvesting marketing lists and stuff? Well, what else do you do when you turn 18? You sign up for the draft, and they pay the selective service agency, I'm sure, for their list of draft people. Because, of course, that's public record, you signing up for the draft. So, anyway, so you get your razor, right? And it was 3 blades. I was like, wow, this is great, right? Great shave, comfortable, works great, whatever. Well, so then the Gillette, or not Gillette, but the, what's the other company, Schick, that has they came out with a 4 bladed one. And the Onion made an article that was like, F everything, we're doing 5 blades. And it's, them talking about the engineers and being like, we can't do 5 blades. And management was like, no, shut up and go back and figure out how to do 5 blades. We're doing 5 blades, F everything. Okay, and the story's really funny and whatnot. And then like a couple years later, what does Gillette do? They actually release a razor with 5 blades. Okay, so anyway, so this is kind of the same thing, right? What YouTube did was they said, okay, F everything, we're doing 64 bits. Okay, now, what's the maximum number of play counts if they use 64 bits? It would be this, right? Okay, because they're still going to include the ability to process negative play counts. Um, why? Well, maybe they want to be able to punish people like, no, these 10,000 play counts were clearly from bots. We're not paying you ad revenue on bots that are watching YouTube videos, right? Okay, so fine. So what is that number? That's a much larger number. And in fact, let's take that number, and this is Wolfram Alpha, so I can actually do natural language process. Natural language processing. Okay, so it's going to take the 2 to the 63 minus 1, okay, so that maximum number of play counts under the new system, and divide it by the population of everybody that's alive on the entire planet. Okay, so every single person on the entire planet would have to watch the Gangnam Style video 1.22 billion times each before we break YouTube again. Okay, so challenge accepted, hopefully. Yeah, cool. Okay, good question, right? It depends on the hardware that's processing it, right? So modern processors are all 64-bit processors, and they are capable of doing 64-bit integer arithmetic in hardware. So it's really fast. Okay, now, where that actually can slow down things is with floating point stuff, and we'll talk about floating point probably sometime starting maybe Wednesday next week, roughly. Okay, so floating point's a whole other bag and a lot more complicated to deal with. But yes, fair question. And in particular, right, if you wanted to do, like, let's say you wanted to do 64-bit arithmetic on the 8-bit Nintendo, well, you'd have to do it as 8-bit chunks. And that would mean that each addition would require like 16 operations. So it's going to be slow. Not for the arithmetic. Okay, so the question was if you have a quad core processor, uh, no, because each processor can do, uh, each core is almost like an independent processor. They're doing their own things, right? And it's actually quite tricky to take a process and parallelize it, right? So let's say you had a gajillion numbers that you wanted to add up. What you would do in that case is you'd say, okay, processor number 1, add up the first quarter gajillion. Processor number 2, do the second, and so on, and then add the answers at the end. But not all processes are like that, right? So, I mean, here's a silly example. If one woman can have one baby in 9 months, 9 women cannot have 1/9 of a baby in 1 month and then add the results together at the end, right? That is not a parallelizable process, but some other processes are. So anyway, all right, it's 8:50. We should quit, and I guess I will see you guys on Monday. Yeah, have a good weekend.